The deal passed off the back of COP28 calls for the transitioning away from fossil fuels in our energy systems, beginning in this decade in a just, orderly and equitable manner so as to achieve net zero by 2050. The new compromise calls for transitioning away from fossil fuels rather than a phase-out, despite the demands of more than 100 nations. The UN climate chief, Simon Steele, said that the deal is the beginning of the end for fossil fuels. The deal passed almost immediately, the smoothest most have ever seen a deal go through with no objections raised. Authoritarian agendas have a tendency to pass rather quickly because they're not subject to scrutiny or democratic procedures. World leaders who hopped into their array of carbon-spewing private jets to tell the rest of us we need to use less fuel, proudly declared that this is the first time in almost 30 years of COP climate summits that a fossil fuel agreement has been reached. But there's one major flaw in this plan. It doesn't make sense. We need cheap fuel. It's not expendable, it's essential. Cheap fuel is essential for alleviating poverty, for spreading prosperity, and for promoting economic growth globally. And the climate doomsters may say that economic benefits are unimportant, but that's not right. They are essential. And even the gloomiest forecasts are not talking about Armageddon. The world will continue, and yes, there may be some ameliorations that are needed, but even if the temperature rises, the world will still continue. And what we need is for the market to lead the way in energy advancement. We need the technology to develop first, and then in the immortal principle of supply and demand, take the reins from there. Why is this important? Because as you see how energy has evolved over hundreds and thousands of years, it has always been that economies have grown as energy has got cheaper and more plentiful. And so we need to know what the more plentiful and cheaper energy will be first before we phase out the energy that has been the staple. And this leads on to what's happening in one of Great Britain's last remaining territories, the Falkland Islands. It is rich in oil resources, yet this vital, lucrative and enriching industry is under threat under COP's new fossil fuel agenda, which leaves us dependent on fossil fuels coming from dictatorships. And it's always been part of Britain's territorial deal with the Falklands that they, the Falkland Islanders, should have the ability to economically self-sustain themselves. If His Majesty's government is sincere about honouring this commitment to this territory, it must allow the islanders to develop their own resources. Also, the deal poses a serious risk to all its citizens' well-being over here on the mainland. It'll push up our bills, force us to rely on foreign imports, make green energy that is expensive the mainstay and sometimes unavailable when the wind isn't blowing, and this will cost you, the hard-working citizen, as our economy doesn't grow. As ever, I want to hear from you, mailmog@gbnews.com, but I'm delighted now to be joined by senior meteorologist and social commentator Jim Dale. Jim, thank you very much for coming in. Hello. This deal of phasing out fossil fuels, we're going to be dependent on fossil fuels for a long time to come, realistically.
Yeah, you said phasing out. I think that's the word that got taken out. Transition.
Transitioning, yes.
Yeah, that is the word that has been put into. Look, we're in the right place. It's a line in the sand, quite obviously, in terms of going forward. A lot of clapping, a lot of congratulations, but it's talk. And I actually think this is a small step for man, but not necessarily a giant leap for mankind.
But they said 2 years ago at COP26 that they were going to stop coal. And actually, we've seen more coal power stations opened in the last 2 years, particularly in China. And so they say these grandiloquent things, and then countries like the UK go ahead and do them and make ourselves less competitive, and countries like China don't take a blind bit of notice and make themselves more competitive and more prosperous.
Except we're not, because there's a coal mine opening in Cumbria from this government. It's allowing it to happen. The Rosebank oil licenses have been awarded again, and therefore it's a step backwards. It's Mr. Sunak sitting on his fence gathering splinters. That's where we are.
But the coal field is to provide coal for domestic industry that is currently importing coal. So that's a perfectly sensible thing to do. It's replacing other supplies. It's not making the UK economy more net dependent on coal, whereas in China they are actively opening, and I believe in Germany as well, they're actively opening coal-powered stations.
But at the same time, they're actually pushing, as well you know, in China, the solar energy side of things is far outweighing what's happening in this country, for example.
But solar is interesting because solar is an area where the technology has advanced to be cost competitive. And that's fine. Nobody like me would argue against something once it's become cost competitive. It's these latest offshore wind contracts that are about double the price of the nuclear contracts.
But I always say we're in a process of evolution, not necessarily revolution. If you take yourself back in the ages, things that we have now that we take for granted, they always start at a very high premium price, and in time they all come down. Everything that you can think about touching.
Yes.
It's that progress when things become, and therefore this transition zone that we're in is going to be at times painful in terms of some of the economic sides. But I should say the economic side is a false argument because you know, I'm a meteorologist at the end of the day. I chew the numbers, I look at the data, and I see what's going on. So Malaga, for example, yesterday 29.9 degrees in December, beat its old December record by not 0.5 degrees but 5 degrees. Phenomenal. This is the sort of thing that we're seeing, and you take yourself back 2 years, over the last 2 years, and you've seen what's going on in terms of the world, and that's the economic loss. And Deloitte, who you'll know very well, have assessed that in the next 50 years, that the cost of doing net nothing means that it's going to be running into literally hundreds of trillions of pounds lost.
But that's extremely speculative against the known cost of trillions of pounds if you actually take these steps until the technology is there. So I agree with you that technology develops and evolves and gets cheaper, but normally people don't implement it until it's already got cheaper. They don't implement it at the expensive stage.
Why do you think COP is existing? I know this is number 28, and obviously number 1, 2 and 3 failed, didn't get where it need to get to. The Paris Agreement several years ago moved the barriers again. This is another moving, we're going in that direction. Why do you think these things exist in the first instance? Why are they happening? I just put that to you, and I don't want me to answer it, I want you to answer it in terms of saying, why is this going on at all? Why are we moving and transitioning from fossil fuels into the renewable energies?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, I think we are doing something that is harmful to our economies, and that we should allow technologies to evolve and then use them as they become cheap and competitive. I'm not in favour of this compulsion that's making the poorest in the world poorer. I think this is a very bad way of making policy.
I'll tell you what makes the poorest poorer is when there is you get into a situation of drought or lack of water or too much water.
Okay, but
of that.
If you take from 1990 to now, you've seen a collapse in absolute poverty globally. You've seen it go down from over half the world to under 10%. You've seen it go down from 1.8 billion people to under 800 million people. And that's with a growing population. What's done this has been cheap energy and trade. That has fundamentally revolutionised the standard of living of the poorest in the world. And yes, you can point to countries that have drought, but you could have done that at any point in history.
No, I think it's, as I said, I'm a meteorologist, and I look at the data and I see what's going on, and that is why COP28 and COP29 next year is going to be meeting, so that we alleviate these problems. You talk about, there's a lot of talk about migration and boats. I tell you what, one of the biggest concerns going forward will be the impact of weather and climate on these countries that are going to leave people in absolute desperate states. And the next trip is to a boat to get across to somewhere that's a bit better. But so far it's been more,
hasn't it? It's been the destabilisation of Syria, the destabilisation of Afghanistan, the destabilisation of Libya. That's not climate related.
And what comes next? And what comes next? And the reason why we're trying to avert the 1.5, and by the way, we're going to pass 1.5. It'll probably happen in 2024.
But this is... You're on with the scare stories about these things will happen.
It's not scare.
The temperature going up can be ameliorated. You know, the IPCC itself points out there are more deaths from cold than from heat.
No, they're not. That's now globally. That is well in the UK, in England and Wales, it has now changed. And you've got to. Well,
the IPCC put the figures in, and they point out there were more deaths from cold than from heat.
Yeah, I call that a race to the bottom. That's not where we need to be.
All right, you think it's a race to the bottom, but now, thank you very much, Jim. But to take a look at the Falklands with me is the columnist and former editor of the Daily Telegraph, Lord Moore. Charles, thank you very much for joining me. This seems a very odd situation for the Falklands to be in, which you highlighted in your Telegraph column this morning.
Yes, I think it's very unfortunate. And actually, it happened on the British watch because it happened at the COP26 in Glasgow. And agreement was made that we shouldn't help develop international hydrocarbons. And the British government chooses to regard the Falklands in this respect as international. So the government's actually been very helpful to British exploration for oil in the Falklands. But now that it's got to the point of extraction, the possibility of extraction, the government is refusing to give a guarantee, to put a guarantee behind a bond issue. And there needs to be such a guarantee because the Falklands involves political risk. So because of the Argentine threat to the Falklands. So a normal bank will not underwrite such a project. But such a project is there. There's lots of oil there. And it would be logical and beneficial to Britain, by the way, if Falklands oil could be extracted. There's a large amount of it in the Great Sea Line field. But so far they've been saying no.
But this is very odd, isn't it, Charles? Because the government announced that it was going to give more licensing rounds in the North Sea. So clearly the UK mainland counts as domestic, and a territory with whatever it is, about 2,000 British citizens living in it, counts as foreign. That seems a most peculiar differentiation to make. Yes, and I wonder if... I'm not quite sure what the bureaucratic mind is doing here. It may be that this is they're just worried about political argy-bargy. Sorry, I shouldn't. Argy-bargy is the wrong phrase to use in relation to Argentina. But really, maybe they just think it's a bit too risky politically. But if we had, it would be a secure supply. It would greatly benefit the Falkland Islands. And one of the problems with British oil is that we do not have a national reserve in the way that for oil security in that sense. And that could be very largely provided with the help of Falklands oil. I think it's a real opportunity being missed for both our very loyal overseas territory and for this country. Because this is really important, that the quantity here is much greater than the quantity that we are likely to get from the new licenses in the North Sea because of the long-term depletion of the North Sea. In the Great Sea Line alone, field alone, it's thought to be 2.7 billion barrels. I think what's claimed, and I can't claim to be an expert on this, is that if we made full use of Falklands oil, we could halve our net imports of oil. So this is really important because it's part of the green ideology, isn't it? That basically anything you do which helps your own economy, that uses fossil fuels that you're going to use anyway, is bad, and you should get your fossil fuels from dictatorships and unstable regimes. It's a most peculiar political situation to be in. The whole thing's very strange. In your earlier discussion you just had with Jim, I think the one thing that got missed in that discussion is that whatever is said at COP doesn't necessarily produce the desired result. So that
the most demanding
Sultan Al Jaber, who's in charge of COP, is of course also the oil minister of UAE, and I don't believe that this communique that finally got put out, or this agreement that finally got put out, is really going to make such countries control their hydrocarbons. So what tends to happen is that the more obedient nations, such as ours, tend to sacrifice our own advantages, and the less obedient ones don't sacrifice them. So Britain and British people tend to suffer from these agreements, and the people who are actually producing far more fossil fuels continue to do so, such as China. Well, thank you very much, Charles. It's worth pointing out, I was very briefly Energy Secretary, and whilst I did try to push to get the Falkland Islands able to get their oil out. But my special advisors, as were, reminded me that they ran into an awful lot of official obstruction as they tried to do it. There really is a blob that doesn't want us to have energy security. Thank you again, Charles.